Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now we have a very big episode. We're going to be focusing almost exclusively on the European Parliament elections. And oh boy, I mean, there was something. Uh, Look, people were saying the populists underperformed. Granted, that is true in some cases. In other cases, I would say not so much. Of course, the media is going to try to play this off, but the main trend we saw here was the collapse of the center. We saw massive surges in green parties throughout Europe and other more socialistic left-wing parties, and populist and nationalist parties. Now, in terms of the largest individual parties, now keep in mind this information may be out of date by the time it is broadcast because we're about, I don't know, about like 21 hours behind by the time this is recorded, by the time it's aired. But as it stands, there's a three-way tie between Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, Farage's Brexit Party, and Salvini's Lega Party are all the biggest individual parties, not coalitions, but individual parties at 29 seats apiece. So that's where it stands right now. But before I get into any election results, what you have to keep in mind looking at these is the European Parliament has very little power on the surface. Their main control is they decide the European Commission, who makes a lot of decisions. Currently, the current commission is made up of the EPP, which is the establishment right-wing party, with figures such as Jean-Claude Juncker, and Merkel's party is part of the EPP as well. And just to give you a little bit of thing, you won't be able to see this because we're using Skype this time, but the current parliament map looks something like this. So the left-wing coalition has 38 seats, the Social Democrats have 50, Greens have 70, the Liberal coalition has 107. The others, more the independent ones, which would include the five-star movement, such in Italy, have 28 seats. Independents have 7 seats. The center-right has 179. The ECR, which are the conservatives, more like what in Poland, has 58, which is still a major jump. The populists, which is such as your Salvinis, your Farages, have 56, and then your outright nationalists, maybe someone like Le Pen, the ENF, has 58 seats. Now, pretty much all on the right and the Green Party were the ones that took major jumps. This graph does not show it now, and I could not find a graph that showed the actual changes, but just keep that in mind going through, and we're going to get into the UK. So, unless you have any takes on just the general topic, I'll jump right into some of the nitty-gritty results.
Right. So obviously, there is a polarization that's coming, and it is something that we've been expecting to occur in the EU. This polarization is a process that's taking place all over the West. It's taking place in America, definitely. The question going forward, we can flesh it out later, is how well will, say, Salvini be able to work with Orban, given that Salvini has slightly changed his position on immigration and on migrants? Orban has not. Le Pen no longer thinks that the EU has to be done away with. They're all trying to find a way to revamp the EU, as it were. So I hate to say it, but although the results are positive, and generally speaking, for the kind of maximal change that we want to see or that we expect in the 10 years going forward, will require some polarization. The fact is, some of the populist groups are kind of changing their platform, and they also have to do things such as, Orban's already done it, but to kiss the ring of Netanyahu. Salvini is looking for a flat tax that would help corporations. So I'm afraid of a kind of a compromise has, to some extent, has set in, and that the focus now after 2015 will be towards big business, big finance, and so on.
I do share those concerns, but one thing I will say is it's the curse of democracy where every few years they're going to have to do this either in rhetoric or in some policy because of election seasons, whether that pander to the electorate or whether they have to pander to the donor class and the elites. So, yeah, I share your concerns, but like as you said, there's probably going to be a lot more polarization. But the unfortunate thing is, as election cycles come around every 5 to 10 years, at least in the European case, this is going to happen.
Right, right. I mean, but parties that are outright about independence, like Golden Dawn, have like lost half their seats. Like, so I'm just saying that we've witnessed Trump getting sort of swallowed in by the swamp, and we shouldn't forget that much of the migration and immigration, although it's still going on, has dramatically stopped, primarily because France and Germany are donating hundreds of millions of dollars to various African countries in order to keep their people there, because there was an actual concern that a possible revolution would or could occur. But anyways, that's all I'll say for now.
Okay, so with the bit of black was out of the way, which by all means definitely legitimate concerns I actually do share, but let's get right into the nitty-gritty. So, in the UK, there was, I wouldn't really call it a surprise, but Farage's new Brexit party, which keep in mind is only about 6 weeks old, managed to sweep the election, take the plurality of 31.6% of the vote. That was followed by the Liberal Democrats, who are, of course, part of the Liberal coalition of the EU Parliament. Gained 13%, bringing them up to a 20.3%. The Labour Party is at 14%, down 9% from 2014. The Greens are at 12%, up 5% from 2014. The Conservatives are down 15%, no surprise, with Theresa May's recent bungling of things over the past few years. The Scottish Nationalist Party and the other parties affiliated with them are at 4.6%, which is up 2%. The Change UK, which is the party that sort of just sprung out of nowhere in order to challenge Brexit, in order to bring them back in the European Union, they got 3.4%, which of course up 3.4% because they did not exist in 2014. And the loser of the day was UKIP, down 25%, which is very easily explained by the fact that Farage started a new party.
Right, and about 90% of the party migrated towards him anyway. So, I mean, people, for right or wrong, will blame Sargon for this, but the truth is, once Farage was really that party, and once he left, it was basically over. So,
yeah, as you were bringing up, UKIP's big strategy was to bring in the internet celebrities, thinking that would translate to votes, which, as we saw, it did not. But before that, it's fun to poke fun at the morons that they tried to recruit there. But the one thing we do have to consider is Gerard Batten, who was the leader of UKIP immediately after Farage resigned after Brexit, and Farage did not like each other. They were not friendly with each other. So, of course, once Farage got back into politics, he was going to have to start his own party. So, no surprises there. And it was actually kind of encouraging. I was expecting the British people, again, we are a bit harsh on the Anglos on the show, if you will, but I was expecting them to sort of go with either the Lib Dems, which they did to a degree, or Labour. I didn't expect the Conservatives to win at all, but I didn't expect a Farage victory. I thought he would do well. I thought he would take a stronghold in it, but I did not expect him to take the plurality.
I would agree. I think he did remarkably well. I'm surprised. I didn't think he would win. Given, I mean, in a sense, the last 2 years he's really been. I wouldn't want to say a non-person, but he
in retirement, pretty much.
Yeah, sort of retired. And under those circumstances, not relevant. But like you say, 6 weeks, he creates a party, one issue, and it really became the barometer of how the British people, especially England, feel about Brexit. You see a lot of gaslighting, whether it's France 24 or whether it's BBC or Sky News. They really are trying to downplay this. They're basically saying, well, if you include all the other parties, most Britons are against Brexit. This is after the vote has already been decided upon.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I actually saw pretty much the Europe elects had this going around. The hard Remain parties and the hard Leave parties were pretty much about. I think the one was at I think hard Remain parties was at 40% and hard Leave parties was at 38%, and then the rest were the either somewhere in the middle ground. But point being is, it's not like it's some major boost over. It's 2%.
right, right. So there's a 2% difference, and a lot of it is because I think basically the British people have been worn down from May's lack of success. So I it's probably not so much the issue itself or the way it's been conceptualized, but the difficulty with which it's been met in manifesting it, in the way May navigated through all of this. That can create a sense that this is going to be very hard, and it's maybe we're not better off. So basically, it's demoralized people in Britain, I think. This nearly now 3 years after the vote.
Yep, we're actually about a month out from the 3-year anniversary. But you bring up Theresa May. Now, she's been dominating the headlines lately because of a statement she made on Friday. Now, unfortunately, I do not have the video, but she has announced her resignation effective June 7th, and she got a little bit teary-eyed. Now, out of all the things that's happened in her tenure, out of all the crises she had to deal with, she got teary-eyed when she realized, I won't have a job anymore. So, it's always nice to see, even though it probably won't make much of a difference, to see these absolutely reprehensible people go out in shame. I mean, look, you had someone like a Barack Obama. He was reelected. He served out his 2 terms that he could serve out, and he went off peacefully into the sunset. You had Hillary Clinton, all things considered. I mean, rather than her occasional complaining to the media, went off relatively peacefully. It's not a common occurrence where these types of people, these establishment type people, leave in shame. Now, rarely do they end up in cells or end up facing punishment for what they've done, but rarely do they leave in shame. Which this is probably the best we're going to get, and I'll take it.
I didn't expect her to cry. There's a Bob Dylan song in my head, but I won't mention it because it'll just be too gross.
Oh.
And she cries just like a little girl. But yeah, I didn't expect her to get so teary-eyed about it. Listening to her speech, I honestly, I was persuaded to believe that she really does believe in global homo values. Like, it was, you're basically, the subtext was diversity is our strength and openness.
I may be the second woman prime minister, but I will not be the last. That was the one that really stuck out to me, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah. All the very important issues in democracy and so on. But then she just, turned around, became emotional and just took off. Didn't expect that.
Now, I think the emotions were legitimate, but I don't think it was over some sort of like, oh, I failed my people, like, or more so like, oh, I've been kicked out of job and I've lost my cushy position. That's where I think the tears came from. I don't think they were crocodile tears, but I think she was weeping for herself, if anything.
It's very possible. I think my guess is that she felt very ashamed.
Yeah, I can understand that point of view. Like, you get to a certain point where even it's so bad that you, a soulless globalist, has to shed a tear or two.
Well, I mean, she's probably read some of the headlines and what people think of her. Not to mention that when people were watching give the speech live, there were several pubs in London that were literally celebrating when she walked away from the cameras.
I mean, of course, Labour and Lib Dem hated her because she was a conservative, but even the conservatives hated her. But out of all of this, I do have to say, out of everyone in the past, 10 years in European politics, I would say David Cameron had the best foresight. As soon as it was over, he said, oh yeah, I'm not dealing with this. See you guys later.
Yeah.
But now discussing possible successors, the big name that's been thrown around, I've seen other ones thrown around, but the big name that's been thrown around, most likely and most well known, is Boris Johnson. Now, Boris Johnson,
Yeah.
of course, he's infamous for being the Trump doppelganger, especially in the hair. It's quite surreal, actually. Now, he was a hardcore Brexiteer. He was very on board with Brexit, getting out of the European Union, and to his credit, but he was also the former foreign minister. He was the foreign minister during the Skripal crisis, which showed you what he really thinks about Russia. So he would be good on the Brexit issue, but in terms of, like, I don't want to call him a neoconservative because I know, like, in terms of British politics, that isn't really a term, but he's pretty much the British version of an American neoconservative, if I had to say anything, except he has the foresight to see that, oh yeah, the European Union is garbage and the British need out. But granted, he wants that because he wants to be part of this greater Anglosphere sort of union with the United States, preserving the liberal hegemony of the globe, if you will.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up and you tied it in with him. As I touched on earlier, you can see that big business is trying to find an avenue into this wedge, into this kind of distrust that the foundation stock of various Western European nations and Western former colonial nations have been feeling the last few years, and that is they're using some of the populist sentiment. They're going to own the libs in some situations, but in the end, it just translates into perks for big business, for the very rich. But there's another level to this, and that is there are speculations, that Britain removing itself from the European Union would end up in the arms of one of the American factions. Like, it's hard to call it Trump's faction when it seems like he has so little input in it, but that's ostensibly what it would be. And Boris Johnson's sort of antagonism towards Russia and being a hard Brexiteer kind of suit the situation.
Yeah, and if I do recall, he's a bit more on the Zionist side too, so perfect fit for that sort of situation.
Right, and this is the peculiar thing, is that all these populist movements at one point or another have to pledge some allegiance to Zionism in a way that you'd have to ask yourself, is Zionism itself is afraid of European nationalism, or the European nations and their own particular forms of nationalism. So, in a way, is there to assuage their fears.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, the Israelis know damn well that if the Europeans and the Western world large embrace nationalism, they're going to abandon them because Israel is of such little strategic value of the Western world at large. I mean, it's in the Eastern Mediterranean, which isn't really concerned of any of the major naval powers. And again, their famed technology, is based on U.S. aid and what they steal from the U.S. So Israel realizes that they don't offer much, so they need to appeal to the ideological side, whether that be some sort of Christian Zionism or some sort of we're the only liberal democracy in the region. But it's funny, while they do this, they can't help but take jabs at countries, specifically Poland for some reason. I don't know what it is with Poland, but they can't help but browbeat the countries that support them. They've even done this to Trump to a degree, especially before he got elected and before he really kissed the ring. But it's interesting because they're so concerned about the Western world drifting away from them, but then they take these cheap, unnecessary attacks at them. So it's almost a bit comical. Like,
right. But I think, they're coming from a position of power, because I see, granted, a lot of the leaders or would-be leaders that they appeal to, that Netanyahu particularly appeals to, like Orban or Salvini or so on. These are still, they're charismatic. They are leaders, but they're either small leaders or would-be leaders, right? And in a sense, you could say that the European Union, even Europe, is not ready for them yet. But their acquiescence, nonetheless, to Netanyahu, to Zionism, isn't just merely par for the course for various European countries, but they feel like it's kind of like Bolsonaro has to go to Jerusalem and kiss the wall. They all have to kiss the wall. So yes, Israel, Netanyahu, or Jewish power has to be alleviated of its fears and so on. But at the same time, it's coming from a position of strength, right? All the language, all the visual language that it's using implies so. Like the fact that they have to visit Jerusalem and kiss the wall and so on. Now, that said, I think they're also trying to determine what the boundaries are. And I think this is why they're going particularly after Poland. Why they decided that Poland has to be fleeced of money? Why did they think that this is their comeuppance? It's probably several things. It's not just one reason, but I would say that in a similar way that religion has started to play a much bigger role in Russia, the same thing has happened in Poland. And when we're talking about religion, it's a specific one for Poland. It's Catholicism, and it's a much less syncretic country in that regard in comparison to Russia. I think that's why they've decided to target Poland. But again, I think there's other reasons behind it, because in similar fashion, they haven't gone after Hungary. So, that's probably a topic we should cover sometime, or more in depth later on.
Interesting that you bring that up, because I was actually about to segue. Like, in terms of them having to kiss the ring of something, like you see with Hungary and to an extent Salvini, is they've been very pro-Russia. They've been very open to negotiations and talking with the Russians. And one could say it's like, I'm not saying the Russians are completely free of Zionist influence or anything, or that they. I mean, look at Syria if you want to see that. It's not exactly they're playing both sides or anything, but I would say almost in a way, getting closer ties to the Russians, to Putin, is a way a bit to offset the Zionist influence.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I think that process.
And Poland. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because Poland is not going towards Moscow, at least for the time being. So, I mean, of course, Israel's going to take it out on them. Whereas, look, if they tried to do the same thing to Italy or Hungary, they would just be like, okay, I'm going to go visit Putin. I'm going to go to the Kremlin. And I mean, again, that then sends a message to Jerusalem, sends a message to Brussels, sends a message to Washington, depending on who they're dealing with at the moment, not to get on too much of a tangent.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Poland has positioned themselves at that, and there's very little wiggle room there.
But with that, I will move on to Germany, because Germany, this is actually a bit more comical than anything. So there were big wins for the Grün Party, or the Green Party, if you will, and unfortunately the AfD underperformed. Now, for the official vote totals, Merkel's CDU/CSU, which is part of the European People's Party, the EPP, got about 28% of the vote, down 7% from the last election. Green Party is 20%, up 9% from last election. Then the Social Democrats, 15%, down 11%. AfD at 10%, up 3%. The Link, which is like the left-wing party, just a broad left-wing party, at 5.4%, down 2%. The FDP, which is the Liberal Party, is up 2% at 5.4%. One of the more satirical parties, which is just called Party, is at 2.4%, is up 1.9%. So, I mean, yeah, you've had a satire party. I mean, it's funny. You get these in European politics a lot, and they actually do perform. And then another one, the Liberal Party's at 2%. Then, again, just a coalition of other smaller parties, part of more liberal left. But point being is, yes, the ADF saw an increase, but not as much as they expected. And the Green Party saw a pretty big boost. Now, among first-time voters, the Green Party dominated. Now, let's ask ourselves, in Germany, what happened between 2014 and 2019 that would have seen a massive influx of first-time voters in the 2019 election? What do you think that could have been?
Well, it could have been some of the refugees if they've got civilian status now.
Well, I mean, that's a plausible theory, but I'm not going to say 100%.
Well, they did take in 1 million, but
Yeah, but of course,
wait, you're arguing this is the reason for AFD's underperformance?
I'm arguing it's for the Green Party's massive surge.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, the Green Party's always been strong in Germany. I mean, it does originate from there.
Yes.
I mean, it tends to be strong in basically Germany, France, and Britain, but especially in Germany and to a lesser extent in France.
And another thing you have to consider is Germany didn't start its whole, oh, a lot of people can come in just during the refugee crisis. Now, granted, during the refugee crisis, it increased, but they were letting in people pretty much ever since the reunification of the country. And of course, as they come there, they have their children. They of course, are citizens. They can vote in the elections. Now, I'm attributing it, like I said, I know the Green Party's always had a strong presence, but you're kidding yourself out there in the audience if you don't think demographics played a significant part in this.
Right, right. I do think, though, it's still a party of basically middle class and upper middle class whites, and German Germans,
Yeah,
as opposed to recent Germans, and basically liberal-minded students and so on. I also think one of the reasons that the Green Party is gaining, and it isn't because of these, spectacular Soros-funded parades and demonstrations that they're doing, but I think they sense that there's been a fallout in the center left. I think that's obvious.
Oh yeah, similar to how the populists are doing the right. They can eat up the more moderate votes by it's like, look, we're actually effective. We'll actually do something. We actually stand for something instead of just these people in the center. So it's sort of the same thing, except from a left wing perspective.
Right, and in a sense, you could say that the left now has begun to mirror the right. This process started with the right first, in reaction to center-based politics, right? And it has, definite issues that are of core interest to it, such as migration, refugees, to a lesser extent, wages, and so on. But I think the Green Party represents for the leftists a stronger ideological base, a base that is actually centered in values more so than just pure economics. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think they're looking for relevance, and the Green Party has become the party of relevant liberal values, and you can see this in the protests and the way European media covers the climate change, right? Of course, the protests. They're obviously there was a lot of money in the kind of costumes that they've used, the kind of signage that they've employed. So you can tell it's very middle class.
Yeah, they have that new mouthpiece kid, like the 16-year-old girl, whoever they're bringing in front of all these international events.
Girl.
Yeah.
Right, and it's even upper middle class, right? And but that's their panic, right? So the right has its panic, and this is the moral panic for the left. In a way, you could say it evades the migrant question and focuses on a different set of concerns and values.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Now, yeah, I just thought that was an interesting little event in Germany. Unfortunately, the AFD did underperform a bit, but going to Germany's very closely related neighbor, Austria, following the recent scandals with the FPO, which is their populist party, they lost only 2% of support in the polls compared from 2014 to now in 2019. And they still managed to pull off third place in this election. So the center-right, the current technically ruling party, took first place with 26.98% of the vote. The Social Democrats, 24% of the vote. The populist FPO with 19.72% of the vote, which is actually up from the polls. Actually, up they regained that 2% and then some. And then the Green Party, actually in Austria, a bit of an interesting trend reversal. They came in fourth, second to last place with 14% of the vote. And the Liberal Party, the NEOS, came in dead last with 8.14% of the vote. Now, the FPO, the populists, they have lost, but much less than many in the establishment and the liberal mainstream had hoped. And they're definitely far from destroyed. Now, the opportunistic center-right made gains despite shamelessly using the scandal for political power. Now, the left wing made up, again, they did not perform well in this election. And this election has solidified that Sebastian Kurz, the current chancellor, will be resigning and handing over the elections to September, which means his government order will only last 2 years, and he's pretty much going to stay in office throughout the summer until the coming elections, in which we'll see how those go. I mean, with these election results, they were hoping to collapse the populists, the nationalists in Austria, but again, they actually regained everything they had lost in the polls. So this scandal fell completely flat on its face.
Right, and you're right. They hadn't suffered, although European media, DW and so on, tried to make it look like it was devastating, because in a way they strawman the situation by claiming that the expectations were so high that, well, I mean, considering the scandal happened just days before, it hasn't been a real shock. And in September, a lot of this might blow over. So we could see something, an election where we'll have a leader that's center right again.
Yeah, I imagine the September election, they're going to do they're going to pull out every stop to stop the populist right. But my prediction for that election, of course, is a bit of a ways out, that they're going to form some sort of center-left, center-right coalition, or the left wing's going to manage to pull off a coalition. But the populist right, the FPO, is going to probably be the main opposition party.
Right. It'll be hard to tell. It depends on a lot of factors. Depends how Syria goes. Depends what happens in Iran. It really does. So we don't know.
Oh boy! I mean, honestly, had this energy crisis, if you will, had the crisis in Hormuz, in the Persian Gulf, happened a bit sooner, and the results in the energy prices took effect, who knows how this election would have gone? I mean, and honestly, looking into election in the future, as tensions will likely rise to Iran, as energy prices will likely go up, it's going to be interesting to see how these European elections play out. That's one thing a lot of people aren't considering.
Right. But I think our forecast is gonna bear out. I do, especially yours. I think it'll probably left center. However, if we look at the Green Party as a kind of a litmus test for, say, wealthy liberal attitudes and so on, them losing points, and Austria is not a poor country. Probably means that there isn't going to be like some kind of party in between center left and the Green Party taking reins and dominating Austrian politics for the foreseeable future. So I doubt that is going to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I do want to move on to Denmark, because Denmark is actually a bit of an interesting case in which I want to point something out. So, in Denmark, the liberal establishment won the election with 23.5% of the vote, up 7%, followed by the Social Democrats at 21.5%, up 2%, the Green Party in Austria, 13%, the Conservatives, 10%, and the other Liberal Party, 10%. But point being is, the Liberals in Austria managed to hold on to power in a very interesting way. The Liberals in power in in Denmark, my apologies, managed to hold on to power by embracing the hard, quote-unquote, hard right policies on immigration. So, it's showing that, especially in these richer Northern European countries, all of these establishment parties have to do with stay in power is to take just a little bit less migrant labor, and they can maintain their power. I mean, I doubt this would happen in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe because of, again, they're the nations being exploited by Northern Europe, but it just shows to these Scandinavian countries, to Germany, to the UK, if you're willing to just take in less immigration and have a stricter immigration policy, the people aren't going to rebel against you.
Right, and you can see that when Macron shut the border with Italy, that this had it had an effect on immigration as well. And as I mentioned, they have increased funding to African countries in order to avoid more migrants entering into Europe. Even if it all stopped yesterday, the kind of problems that Europe is going to run into in the next 20 years concerning demographics, the kind of sort of racial tensions that we're seeing develop in America, for instance, where racial consciousness of non-whites is going to become very strong. Like, that trend is not going to go away. In fact, you could argue that some of these peoples feel threatened by reducing immigration, that there's a kind of panic that sets in, that momentum could be taken away from them. And that in itself feeds a kind of, could feed a kind of pointedness towards let's say, the host civilization, the host population. So, it's interesting that it doesn't take that much for them to gain votes if they just change a few little things. I'm kind of surprised, I have to say that in 2015, 16, even 2017, if someone said that they're going to reduce the amount of migration, that they're going to, and who knows, really, like, there's a strong possibility that maybe America would have done more in Syria. Maybe Russia and America might have fallen into an even worse scenario. And more migrants, refugees and migrants could have entered. But the fact that both Macron and Merkel were afraid, from what their intelligence agencies, that, with particular the one in France, that 10 years from now, the possibility of a revolution or a civil war in France is extremely high, much higher than it's been in well over half a century. So they have responded, right? They are actually afraid. And I have to be honest, it's something that I didn't think that they would respond in kind.
I have to agree with you. And also, you bring up an interesting point in terms of, look, who knows, especially with the way Trump's administration is going. If after the 2020 election, if after Trump gets his second term secured, who knows? I mean, if John Bolton, Mike Pompeo are still there, who knows what they'll have him do in the Middle East? Who knows we won't haul off and try to take out Assad? Who knows we won't haul off and try to go to war with Iran? And if that creates another refugee crisis, I'm telling you, Europe is going to go in the opposite direction of the establishment. It is going to make Orban, as I said in previous weeks, it's going to make Orban look like a moderate. So people are really looking at these things, really thinking the situation worldwide, because they just look at it as a European situation. They don't take into account the Middle East, the crisis going on there. They don't take into account Africa. Well, some do. They don't take into account what's happening in East Asia. And you have to realize, right, one of those things tip. I don't know. Let's say there's look, the Chinese are making inroads in Europe. Let's say they piss off one of the countries there, and it could send this negative direction. Let's say there's as I'm predicting, a major backlash against U.S. presence in these countries. That could take a major shift throughout the 2020s. I think people are really overlooking a lot of things when they do analysis of particularly European politics.
Right. And we also shouldn't, you can tell that the EU is trying to achieve some kind of a super state in the same way that America is a giant superstate, right? And in the same way that America literally learned, evolved, developed the idea of maintaining racial tensions in order to drive domestic and foreign policy. Yes, granted, at first it was a country that was expanding rapidly. The need for immigrants was vast. Its ambitions were vast, and so on. But the amount of space is, that isn't that America has already, has been gone for nearly 100 years now. However, the need for like a significant minority population in order to determine domestic and foreign policies, especially domestic policies, is something that obviously Europe is trying to achieve the same way. They basically require about 30% of the population to be an alien population, a population that is not European and comes from, a radically different background. And in this way, they're able to maintain to tamp down on the possibility of revolutions, on small parties looking to create maybe new ties, in diplomatic ways. There's a few small parties within Europe right now that have actually met with Hezbollah, that they see this as a much larger conflict, not just meeting with Russia in order to scare Brussels and Washington. So on some level, yes, the establishment is actually scared. Like I think they were surprised at Europe's reaction to the migrants. And they have had to pull the brakes. And I think that's also why there's this kind of gaslighting, this extreme kind of gaslighting going on. Like, it's true, there are real challenges between, right now with some of Salvini's capitulation and how he's going to work out some of these differences with Orban on, beyond just say financial and economic concerns, right? That's true. And they'll harp on that. But that doesn't mean it's not something that they can figure out later, or that perhaps Salvini will change his mind again, or in any case, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think
the gaslighting, I think, is there to hide the fact that they have had to capitulate to a populist sentiment that doesn't have a particular party or leader at the moment.
And I think you make a really good point with that in terms of the capitulations in general. You have a lot of people, especially in the commentary and analysis sphere of politics, such as ourselves, and I'm not saying I'm not guilty of this, a lot of people who just started paying attention to politics since the 2016 election, of course, throughout into international politics, maybe Brexit, some of the other elections in Europe, whatever, that they're thinking it's just going to be this linear thing, that their side that they want to win is going to go in, just smash, or lose. They don't realize it's going to be a lot of ups and downs, a lot of bumps. Salvini might be capitulating now, but who knows what he'll be saying in 6 months, a year or so. Could be better, could be worse. It's one of these things that, again, people are way too quick to jump on it, and of course the establishment, the media, likes to play these divisions in people that they see a threat, such as I'm not saying this show in particular, but the more alternative media, they'll play that and they'll try to blackpill us. I'm not saying that some blackpilling isn't justified, but again, they will exasperate that. And so when you look at these things, you have to consider it could be a world's difference in 6 months. For example, I thought 2018, I didn't think that Trump was going to get us into a war in Syria, but I thought his actions, especially influenced by Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, would escalate into another full-scale involvement in the Middle East. That's where I was. Here we stand now. Look, I'm very disappointed with Trump, especially in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of going to war in Syria, it does not look likely as of now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it could be because where do the refugees go? Where do they go? Obviously, there's a stopgap, And it's a real consideration. This is why in some of the last week, or was it the week before, when I said, Iran should just they've got 3 million Afghani refugees, let a third of them go to Europe and see what happens. I think European elites are now I think they are definitely concerned, and that too is dividing them. I think there are those who are more cautious, and those within their parties, of course, who want the dramatic changes to accelerate even more. However, I think they've obviously some kind of limit has been reached, right? They are scared, and it's made a difference in how Middle Eastern policy is conducted, right? Not just of a kind of a virtual conceptualization of a war with Iran and what would it take, and we don't factor in refugees and migrants and deaths and reputation and all that kind of stuff. No, all those concerns now are very real. Turkey's been hosting how many 3.5 million Syrians for over 6-7 years now,
since the beginning of the war. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, who is paying for this, right? How does this, how does this affect what kind of deals they make? What kind of resentment is there towards the U.S. and Brussels and NATO and so on behalf of Turkey? How does that play into, the kind of deals and agreements that they're willing to make with Russia? All of these, these are, it's just that, 20 years ago, these weren't, these factors didn't have the same kind of weight that they do now.
Definitely. And moving on, I will say Sweden, I just want to say really quick because the Swedish Democrats had a pretty good boost, but so far, just the results for that is the Social Democrats, 24%, the Establishment Conservatives, 17%, up 3%, the Swedish Democrats at 16%, up 6%, the Green Party at 11%, minus 4%, one of the Liberal parties, 11%, up 4%, another Conservative Party, plus 3%, a left-wing party, 7%, which is up 1%, another Liberal Party at 4%, down 6%, and another Social Democratic Party at 1%, down 4%. So, not much of a surprise out of Sweden. The Swedish Democrats, again, I would say they're more on the, I'd say, Farage tier in terms of populism, where they're nothing too spectacular, but they're definitely better than whatever the hell's going on right now. But it's still nice to see them get a bit of a boost. I mean, they're technically the ones who've gained the most this election, so I just figured I'd throw that small one in before we get into France and Italy and really take this show home. So France, I would say I was a little bit surprised. So the National Rally, which of course the successors of Front National, is at 25.8%, taking the biggest share of votes. However, they're only up 0.9% from last election. Now, the LREM, I can't remember what Macron calls it, but it's Macron's centrist Liberal Party, is at 21.2%. Of course, they're a new party, so the only place they can go is up, so they're technically plus 21.2%, which the media has been very liberally using to say, look how much Macron gained. Well, of course, he founded a new political party. They were at 0% before, so whatever they're going to get is going to be a gain. So, I mean, you compare it to the old party numbers, I haven't, but I imagine the picture wouldn't look as good as they want you to believe. The left-wing party, the Green Party, was at 12.5%, up 3.5%. The Establishment Conservatives at 8.3%, down 12.5%. The left-wing party, which is also a new party, up 6.3%, also, again, a new party. And the Social Democrats are at 5.9%, down 8.4%. Now, Le Pen is riding high on the National Rally and other Nationalist Party victories, and as you were saying before the show, has called for a nationalist alliance in the European Parliament. Now, before then, pretty much Le Pen was saying, let's get out of the European Union. They're of no use to us. We're going to get out, separate France from it altogether. But now she's changed her tone, for better or for worse, saying, let's work within the European Union to accomplish our goals rather than abandoning it. Now, I don't know exactly what to make of it. I would say it's definitely the more pragmatic decision, But just because it's the more pragmatic decision doesn't necessarily mean it's the better decision. Sometimes you want that short-term pain in order for a long-term gain. But again, that goes back to the problem of democracy. People aren't willing to tolerate that short-term pain because they think in cycles of 4 to 8 years, or in Europe's case, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. And part of this is also, I mean, I don't want to get all Spengerian on everybody, but, you know, there's obviously, there is a decline happening in the West. And one can picture that 100 years ago, this situation would have been intolerable. People literally would have been in the streets killing each other over this.
I mean, the entire continent of Europe went to war over a dead archduke, and look at what they're tolerating now.
Right. So, you know, the xenophilia comes out of a kind of decline and a lack of will to, if you will, uphold the culture or uphold the dream and the purpose. So, you know, I think we're going, like, in 10 to 15 years, when those kids that were like very little crossing into Europe are going to be in, you know, between 15 to 30. That's, I think we're going to see like a lot of testing of this resolve. Because right now it's, I mean, Europe, of course, has steadily accepted more and more non-Europeans and so on. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But a lot of it is the foolish wars that we fought as Europeans. But yeah, anyways, I don't want to keep drifting off topic. So,
and while we're drifting on topic, it's almost amazing how we almost have a repeat of the Crimean War, where the Western world, Western Europe, and of course now the United States, will wage these disastrous wars in the Middle East. The Russians will step in and say, let's put a stop to this. The Russians get maligned as the bad guy, and the West ultimately suffers for it. So just a little bit of an interesting parallel at that. Now, you know, how things will turn out, I mean, it couldn't go any way at this point. Now, going into Italy, now, before we do that, I want to show a map for France. Now, unfortunately, there's no screen share on this, so you won't be able to see it as of right now. But you'll see in the map from France, the brown is the National Rally, the orange is Macron's new party. A lot of the rural areas is where National Rally won, which, as we were saying about France, a lot of people think of the urban areas when they think of France, which is why they think it's so liberal. But there is an underbelly in France, maybe underbelly is a bit of a derogatory term for this, of people who are more like Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, where, yeah, like the living standards out there are pretty much like that. So I think a lot of people underestimate France in that regard, in terms of they look at the urban centers, they look at Paris, they look at Nice, they look at whatever and say, oh, France is doomed. Now, I'm not saying France is doing well off, but I'm just saying I think they have that, I would say, secret weapon, that silent, I wouldn't even say silent majority, but I would say that underground that hasn't quite awoken yet, that will probably awaken as these tensions rise, as you were just discussing.
Right, because basically Europe, I mean, it's not, of course, peculiar just to the West. This has always happened with every civilization, that the metropolitan centers, which really do determine much of the domestic policies of a country, and also foreign as well. But let's focus on the domestic. They're highly multicultural, right? And this is what gives them what sort of inflates their power, right? And the governments fully realize this, right? And this, France is an example that the big cities like Paris and I suppose Lyon, are very multicultural, and London is an even probably a better example. Britain as a whole is a better example, and this is what gives them, a much greater sort of force for their weight, this punching above their weight, as it were, because they occupy the urban areas.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to, honestly, the way Afghanistan functions, the way we function pretty much since the beginning of civilizations. That, yeah, the power basis is in the urban centers, and pretty much whoever controls the urban centers controls the country. So, I mean, look, you have Afghanistan. Technically, the government there is in charge, even though the Taliban controls all this rural area. They don't control Kabul, for the sake of that example. So, they're pretty much powerless. Now, granted, it's you see this in Afghanistan's case, so this actually makes a pretty good example. When things start to deteriorate, when they do take up to arms, you see who wins.
Right.
So, with that, I will move on to Italy, which, despite I would say Salvini's recent blunder, still pretty encouraging to see the results there. So, as it stands, Lega earned 34.3% of the vote, which is have them up 28% from the last election. Now, Lega actually overperformed what the exit polls said. The exit polls put them at 27 to 30%. The Social Democrats came in second, which the media would not let you forget about that, at 22.7%, but they're down 18.1% from 2014. The Five Star Movement, which I have to say does play a pretty good counterbalance to some of Salvini's, I would say, more acquiescing policies. I mean, say what you will about Conte, but I think he's a necessary force. I think Five Star Movement is a necessary force. They're at 17.1%, which is down 4%, most of that being eaten up by Lega. The Forza Italia, which is Berlusconi's party, the establishment right wing, is at 8.8%, and they're down 8%. And then the FDI, which I don't know the exact name of it, but it pretty much translates to the Brothers of Italy, is at 6.5% and up 2.8%. Now, the media maligns them as they're technically called a national conservative party. They're pretty similar to the Law and Justice Party in Poland, but they're also considered the successors of the fascist movement in Italy. But they're not a bad party overall, and I would like to see them grow. I think they could play a good counterbalance for some of these things that some of these other parties do. Now, as I was saying, Lega defied the exit polls like they did in the 2018 general elections. Now, the biggest stumbling block for them was their coalition partner, which is the Five Star Movement. Now, the Italian Democrats, as I said, came in second, but received half the vote they did in 2014. Now, as time goes on, Lega will likely consume more and more of the Five Star Movement, as they have done since 2018 and subsequent local elections, for better and for worse. As I said, I think Conte's influence in the government offsets some of the Salvini's worst tendencies, and hopefully, as I was saying, hopefully the FDI movement could maybe go on to take that counterbalance, but overall, I would say Italy was probably the best country out of all this. That they definitely overperformed, and probably the best to look at. And as you can see on the map, those are who won by regions. And I do want to share a certain picture. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see this, but this is Salvini holding a sign that says, translation, #1 party in Italy, thank you. And he has a Trump hat, a picture of Putin, a little Russian flag, an icon of Christ, and there was another thing in there that he had, but pretty much he had all these little interesting things on his shelf in the background of his office.
He is friends with that Russian who created the coalition of families. I forget his name now, but he is a personal friend of his. Yeah, they did show very well. I would say of all the Western countries, definitely. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, Fidesz scored at 52% in Hungary.
Yes, Fidesz outdid them, which was to be expected.
Yeah, and I think did Dla and Justice score like 46 in Poland?
We're going to get into that, but I will check the numbers right now. 45.4.
But yeah, he did well. I mean, obviously the climate has changed, and we should bring up like some of Salvini's capitulations, but in a very slow, gradual way, things are perhaps going in the right direction. And like I said, and like we say, there wasn't a particular leader or a particular party, but given the circumstances, you could say that the it's not the halt, but the dramatic reduction of migrants and refugees flowing into Europe, it is a sign that the elites are afraid, in the same way that the center left and the center right have collapsed in Europe.
Now, I will say this about Salvini's capitulations. Now, I said before, he does what he needs to in a liberal democracy. Now, maybe I have too high of an opinion of the guy. I like him. No surprise. There's the bias there. But I think if he could go full Putin, for lack of a better term, where he pretty much has almost entire control of his country, of his government, I think Italy would probably be the powerhouse of Europe.
It's possible. I mean, I the powerhouse of Europe, I don't know. You know, a lot of it depends on Germany, and a lot of it depends on because it's still the economic center of Europe.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I think as hard times head on, assuming, let's say, Salvini, full dictator tomorrow, his word is law. I think, of course, as the 2020s come, as I said, 2020s likely going to be very tumultuous. I think he'd be setting up Italy in a very good position. Now, I think he's still doing a decent job, but I'm saying, given him full power, I think he would be ready to supplant some of these other countries. Maybe not Germany, like I said, maybe not the powerhouse of Europe, but definitely coming up there. I mean, I think they're already the fourth largest economy in Europe, if you exclude the Russians. But point being is, he's doing a good job regardless of his capitulations. But again, like I said, I think when you had the capitulations from people like Trump, it's, oh yeah, I've been browbeaten down. But again, maybe I have too much confidence in him, but I think Salvini knows what game is being played.
Yeah, he could be being very pragmatic right now. I would hope he wasn't doing it all for his, for vainglory. Doesn't seem like it, and he doesn't seem maybe as compromised as Trump is. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, admittedly, Donald Trump being leader of the United States, I would say, a much bigger power structure probably take a little bit more time to compromise. But when you have a country that's a secondary power like Italy, it probably would have been a lot easier to compromise the leadership. And I think
that's a good point.
I think if that were going to happen, they probably would have done it early on. They would have pressured Conte to fire him, or the Five-Star Movement to govern as like sort of a centrist, sort of liberal type of party, which is what they are in policy. It's just the fact that they're very anti-European Union, at least in its current form. So I think if we were going to see anything, we would have seen it already. But point being is, he's at that crucial make it or break it point where he's either going to be thrown out, compromised, or on his way to becoming the next Orban.
Right, and also, that was a very good point you brought up about it's much easier to achieve what Salvini has done in a second power like Italy as opposed to America. And one of the reasons that we probably won't see something like this ever occur in Germany is, one, they are a very important power, but they're also under tremendous control of American power, and Italy isn't as much, not by a long shot in comparison.
The best I could see for Germany is possibly some secessionism. I know that, especially in the past few years with a lot of the crises in the EU, that Bavarian independence has been talked about. Now, they haven't fully gone through or formed a party for it or anything, but I could see some separatist movements rising in Germany, even just political separatism rather than an ethnic or cultural separatism. But that's probably your best bet, is to shatter Germany as it was throughout most of its history.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but as it stands, it does serve, quite interestingly enough, despite the Nord Stream pipeline, despite all of that, it still does serve largely as the American power base in Europe.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at.
Which you can see with like the Fort Bluff kind of thing that they're trying to shift that to Poland, because again, Poland has put itself in that vulnerable position where they want to be the populist stronghold, yet they also want to ward off Moscow and play the ethnic tensions with Russia and bring up the bad blood they've had throughout their history. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, especially, I mean, look, if American power did start to shift to Poland, we may see a change in Germany, but again, this is all up in the air, and like I said, the 2020s will be telling, especially as America's domestic problems increase, Americans' foreign policy problems will increase, depending on what kind of wars they start. Again, Europe isn't always necessarily on board with our warmongering, so again, it's all up in the air, and a lot of people don't look outside of Europe when talking about European politics. They don't have this mental block anywhere else. They don't have it in the Middle East or East Asia or Latin America. But when it comes to talking about Europe, specifically the European Union, they view it as so insular. Aside from the Russian issue,
Mhm.
that is, and
Mhm.
even people on our side are guilty of that. Even I've been guilty of that at some points.
And I have too. Yeah.
But moving on from the Italians, because like I said, they performed the best. I got to talk about probably my biggest disappointment, which was Spain. So Spain bucked the populist trend, and the Vox Party severely underperformed, at least by my assessment. So the current ruling Social Democratic Party came in at 32.9%, up 10%. The current Conservative Party, which is who the Social Democrats supplanted within the past year, we're at 20%, down 5%. The Liberal Party, 12%, up 2%. The Left Wing Party at 10%, down 8%. So there's that. Vox is up 4% at 6.2% of the electorate. Again, still vastly underperformed, at least by my assessment. I was expecting them to at least break double digits, but I was wrong. The Green Party at 4.7%, up 1%. Some of the separatist parties, they have, of course, their 1 and 2% that they always get. So, yeah, Spain, like I said, I said it just now, a little bit disappointed.
Yeah, I was too. I was expecting more. I think I don't know what the cause of it is. I don't know if it's Spain's economy. With some countries, when there's a polarization and there's an economic downturn, what often happens isn't that a right-wing populist movement arises, although of course Spain had that too. But sometimes a left-wing populist movement arises,
such as during the Grexit
and
crisis in Greece. They elected a far-left coalition in 2015, which we'll get to at the end of the show.
Well, right, but even with FDR in the States, and that was when America was predominantly a 90% white country, and they went left wing in a way that they hadn't before. So that can happen. Russia's another example. So these things are often hard to predict.
I will say I will say this about Spain, though. Okay, so what they have here is one thing they can still really play on that's still really effective. A bit to my surprise is, don't you remember Franco? Don't you remember the evil right-wing dictator Franco, even though he died, again, over 40 years ago at this point, but they still can invoke him. And number two, the Spanish nationalists, the populists, got the rise during the Catalonian secession crisis when Catalonia held that vote. You saw a lot of right-wing nationalists take to the streets in Spain. Since then, the Catalonian secessionism has died down a lot, even in the polls.
Yeah.
And, of course, as that goes on, there's less of an identity for the Spanish to coalesce around, since the Spanish national identity, Spanish national pride, shoots up whenever any of these regions try to succeed, whether that be the Basques, the Catalonians. There's the other one I can't think of off the top of my head, but point being is, so if the Catalonians really get uppity over the next few years, which who knows, then expect Spanish nationalism to rise, and pretty much it's contingent on that issue.
I agree. I think you've hit the nail on the head with that one. That is, I recall that's when, like, up until then, apparently there was no reason for a right-wing populist movement to take place until the Catalonian issue came about, and now that that's simmered down, they're absent. So, there's different factors at work, I guess. Maybe they're maybe they've received less refugees. Maybe they've, that isn't as great as concern for them, or maybe it's a little bit of both.
I would say so, but I'm just saying from the acceleration standpoint, you better be supporting Catalonian nationalism.
Yeah.
So,
definitely.
now getting into the real, I guess you could say, white pills in Eastern Europe, specifically Poland and Hungary are the ones I have. I had some stuff about Croatia, but there wasn't too much of a big news out of there for me to cover. And again, I may cover this later in the week in other videos. Maybe pick up on some of it next week as more news comes out. But the Law and Justice Party is at 45.4%, up 13%. The Centrist Party, which keep in mind, this is pretty much just the conglomeration of we don't like the current government because they have affiliations both with the EDP, the Social Democrats, the Green Party, the European Freedom Alliance, which is the left-wing party that some of these Scandinavian countries are part of. So pretty much just a conglomeration of everyone who hates the current government. They got 38.5% of the vote, and they're down 10.2% of the vote. The WIOSNA, which is the Social Democratic Party, at 6.1%. Now they're a new party, so of course they're up 6.1%. The I believe they just called themselves the Conservatives, which they are actually part of the EFDD, which is the same coalition that Brexit Party was part of, Raj Party was part of. They got about like 4%. They actually lost all their seats from the 4% they had in 2014. The other EDFF party, the K15 as it were, has 3.7%, and the other Social Democratic Party is at 1.2%. So no surprise, the Polish people are very satisfied with their current government, so they're going to pretty much throw all the support around them. And even the opposition in Poland, despite the fact that we see them push all these demonstrations, whether it be the pride parades or the feminist movement or whatever, the opposition, the Polish government, is pretty ideologically in line with the current government, barring a few things. Like, oh, maybe we need some immigration. Maybe we need some immigration from here. So Poland's pretty homogenous politically, and the one sticking point is they're anti-Russia. They're bad blood with Russia over the past couple hundred years, which is really coming back to bite them when it comes to the influence of Washington, Brussels in their country. So they're, again, shooting themselves in the foot with that one, as we were talking about at the top of the show. But no surprise out of Poland, but as I said, it's nice to see a right-wing party do well regardless. Now, unless you have any comments on the Polish issue, I'm going to move on to Hungary because Orban had some pretty good statements on that.
Oh, yeah, let's go to Orban, yeah.
Okay, so the official results were Fidesz with 52.14% of the vote. They won 13 seats overall. The DK party, which is the Social Democratic Party, at 16.26% of the vote. Now, the DK is actually thinking about changing their affiliation to actually one of the more centrist parties, at least on the European Parliament level. That's really a side point. So, the Momentum Party, which is the Liberal Party, I believe that's actually the one that Soros has handed in the most. I could be wrong. They had about 10% of the vote with 2 seats. The other Social Democratic Party with 6.68% of the vote, 1 seat. The Jobbik Party, which is actually, I believe, one of the satire parties based on the affiliation, 6.44% of the vote with 1 seat. And that's 99% of the votes counted. That's the most recent information I could find, with a record high turnout of 43.36% of voters. Now, Orban officially announced upon Fidesz's victory that they had won the election. He said, "We've been assigned by Hungarians to stop migration, protect Europe, and protect the Europe of..." Here, let me start from the top. I kind of botched this. "We're assigned by the Hungarians to stop migration, protect the Europe of nations and Christian cultures. We'll do that." So, I thought that was a pretty strong resolve statement. Now, oftentimes when you hear those kind of statements from politicians, they're usually empty. But of course, we're used to the Western European Anglosphere type of thing. But Orban has delivered, so there's that.
He has delivered, and Putin still hasn't invaded Hungary. It's amazing.
I know. It's like, well, where is the repeat of 1956 that the neoconservatives told me that there would be? Where was Pompeo, you remember back in February, he was over in Hungary bashing Orban's government while praising him at the same time. That was one of the more surreal things I've seen in the past couple of years.
Right, and basically it was Pence couldn't get a "please clap for me" moment.
Yeah, that one was in Poland. That one was in Poland, but yes.
Yeah, I think really of all the countries, the two countries that have it right, and Hungary's also had a difficult history with Russia too in the recent past. So It's not all about bad blood, but I would say Italy and Hungary, especially Hungary and Orban, I think have the kind of the right approach about how to pressure and get the most out of the EU. Because let's not forget, right, that once the Soviet Union fell, there were all these factories that were closed down. They were literally bought up and closed down, right, which created like a migrant influx into Western Europe from Eastern European countries because there were no jobs, right? And that whole period, which was about 10 years, 8, 9, 10 years, that finished. So that boon is over. And you can see, in our days where the influx is coming from. So, some people have argued, some people that are very, like in my own life, there's people I know who are very, I would not say very pro EU, but what they are pro about is not like what, I personally find very unfavorable, who will protect the EU, and they'll make comments like, well, Hungary gets a lot of money. And I said, good, they should get a lot of money. And there's a price. Well, how dare you? How dare you? I said, well, I mean, European power, sovereignty, the whole thing, the whole experiment depends on containing Russia. It's like, well, Hungary's a frontline nation. Why shouldn't they get paid a lot for that? Why shouldn't Poland get a lot for that?
Yeah, you do have to.
They really hate it.
It's
they
hilarious.
really hate it. That really bugs them, right? Because they want both. They want like Russia destroyed, and they want these little countries to fall into place. Well, no, you can't have it both ways.
It makes it even more hilarious because Orban takes the money and then goes to Moscow and shake hands with Putin, and they forge these trade agreements. So it's funny because they want the best of both worlds. They can't get it, yet Orban gets it with little to no repercussions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but in terms of the figurehead of the populist movement in Europe, I am glad it is Orban over Salvini or Le Pen, just for experience reasons alone. And I also think Orban is more willing to balance things with Russia more. I think he knows his way around the neighborhood a bit more than I guess you could say. And I'm not saying that Salvini and Le Pen just came to this yesterday, but I would say they definitely haven't been in this as long as Orban has. I mean, Orban was prime minister in the early 2000s before he became prime minister again. He's always been a major figure in Hungarian politics since the fall of the communist government. So, again, the guy knows his way around his country, he knows his way around the European Union, knows his way around Russia. So, I think in terms of figureheads, he's still probably the best we have.
Right, and yeah, like you say, he is a veteran, and we should also note that he is a veteran in politics who has had power and has been reelected over and over again.
And has had his failures. So, boy, I mean, look at his government in the early 2000s when he tried to govern as an establishment right-winger. That was something.
Right, that's a good point. So, yeah, he's had a lot of experience.
Now, I do want to close out the favorite show. I mean, I believe this nation is very friendly with your people in particular. Greece has has had quite the fiasco with their election. So the New Democrats, which is their established conservative party, won 33.2% of the vote. The Syriza, which is the left-wing coalition that currently runs the country, well, at least up until recently, came in with 23.8% of the vote. The Social Democrats at 7.6%. The one of the satire parties at 5.5%. Again, one of the other miscellaneous parties at 4.9%. More, I guess you say right-wing populist at 4.1%. The EL party, and then a left-wing party at 3% of the vote total. Now, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, who of course is part of the Syriza coalition, has called for a snap election after his party lost the European elections. Now, keep in mind, this is the guy who came to power in 2015, January 2015, called a snap election almost, like 3 weeks in power, and yet stood for election again, got reelected in August, and now he's calling another election. So I'm curious if he's going to try to do the same thing Now, again, I don't think it'll work out for him. Greece has been an interesting situation because their economic situation, they've just been subservient to Brussels and by extent the German government. So,
Yeah.
And with establishing conservatives come in power, if they were to win this upcoming election, and judging by the European Parliament results, they probably will. Not much is going to change.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to agree. You can well imagine that an EU 10 years into the future, and we're not projecting very good years ahead, foreclosing on IMF loans and so on. The way Greece has done may be something of a survival strategy, because as we spoke on the last show, look for things in the next 10 years where Southern European and Southeastern European countries that are in the EU will, as the EU loses power and relevance and significance, look for these other countries to be reduced to a second-class EU level. Greece is kind of almost like the embodiment of that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, they talk about China debt trapping countries. Look what the Germans have done to the Greeks.
Oh, yeah.
I would, hell, maybe the Chinese got the idea from them. I mean, because, look, I'm not saying that...
Not to mention the amount of refugees that they've had to take care of.
Yeah, I mean, but... yeah, I definitely agree, as other countries... Unfortunately, the Italians just barely escaped this earlier this year because they were having a bit of a financial crisis that could have gone this direction. So, pretty much the fate of Eastern and Southern Europe is they're either going to be capitulated to the corpse of the EU, if you will, or they're going to have no choice but to look towards the Russians, or they're going to try to play the Polish game where they try to go to Washington, and of course Washington half-heartedly does it because of the anti-Russia strategy. But again, as things turn sour in the U.S. just in general, who knows how that will turn out. But again, as we've been saying for the past several months, Russia is winning on the quote-unquote grand chessboard just by sitting back and letting things happen as they were, with very little intervention. I mean, for example, they'll step in Crimea, they'll step in Syria, but ultimately, they're just letting things play out, and people are coming to them. The past, I don't know, I'd say ever since Putin came to power, ever since, maybe a little after, maybe after he started his second term, pretty much throughout the 2010s has been all about isolating Russia, which has really come back to bite them in the ass. And ironically enough, by sanctioning Russia, by isolating them, they've been protected from a lot of the chaos.
Right. I was watching Russian news a few days ago, and it'll relate back to this, but it concerned Zelensky, and they had their elections just recently, and Zelensky is saying sort of one thing over another and back and forth, but lately he's been suggesting to dissolve the government, brand new elections. And this,
we covered that last
from
week.
guys like Yarosh, from Right Sector, for instance. And it was very interesting what one of the commentators said. He said, Ukraine is in a moment right now, and actually he suggested that even Kolomoisky, the oligarch, has come out. This guy's literally supported Azov and some of these other so-called right-wing groups, Jewish oligarchs supporting right-wing groups. And so he has literally said that Zelensky should foreclose on the IMF loans because Ukraine is just being used as a tool against Russia. Now, that's something I never thought I would hear. Maybe from other people, but not from Kolomoisky, right? And so the commentator basically said Ukraine has to act now. But the truth is, for Russia, Russians almost hardly ever think of Ukraine anymore. Except for maybe the Donbass, the crisis is sort of passed on. And like Russia isn't going to be affected negatively one way or the other, no matter what Ukraine does. And in the same way, it very much seems that a certain threshold has been passed in EU politics and so on, and it doesn't matter what the EU does; it's not going to have a terrible effect on Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with that, I think that's pretty good to bring us to a close here. Now, this has been quite the spectacle. Now, as I was saying, European Parliament has very little influence beyond determining the Commission, and as it looks, the Commission is probably going to stay within the hands of the centrist. But it's they're not going to be popular, and they're just going to exacerbate the situation. But if we use this to test the waters of some of the national elections and regional elections coming up, looks like Europe, beyond a few stumbling blocks, and I would say quite a few stumbling blocks, they're drunkenly staggering themselves in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is, will
Yeah,
it
I
be
would
fast
say
enough? I would
generally.
say in some cases no, some other cases yes, but yeah, I would say a drunken stagger is probably the best way to describe their current move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's an adequate image. Yeah.
So thank you all for tuning in. This has been the War Report, and we will see you guys next week. And goodbye.
Thanks, guys.